those of you who know what I've done in the past will know that for 20 years in the 70s and 80s I looked at the British state, and since 1991 when State Watch was launched I've been looking at the European state. So my talk will have a EU perspective to it. But I'm going to start off in the UK. The surveillance of opposition and dissent is as old as the state. In the UK, there was a Royal Mail Act, get this, of 1657, which gave a monopoly to the Crown to run the post office, and its objective was to discover and prevent any dangerous or wicked designs against the Commonwealth, by which they meant the British Empire. But that was a monopoly over what we know as a snail mail. Of course, there always have been agents of foreign powers, that is the external enemy, and subversives who seek to change society, who are the enemy within. That is true of nearly every state you can look at. So what is happening now in terms of surveillance or surveillance society is not new.
I'm just going to put that there because I'm not sure everyone can hear. Can you hear at the back? Just want to make sure everyone can hear. Not really. Are these picking up? Okay. So if I put that a bit closer, between the two.
Surrounded by this. Don't worry. What's important to remember, what's happening is the phenomena is not new, the way states operate is not new, but what is new are the forms of surveillance which are available to the state and how they choose to use them. It's important to remember that from 1657 to the late 1970s, it was the post office which was carrying out the opening of the mail, but also responsible for telephone tapping. I dug up some figures. In 1940, during the Second World War, there were 125 telephone tapping warrants and 1,557 mail opening warrants. That was in 1940. And I looked up as I keep it up to date, the comparative figures for 2014 on the same standards of 1940 figures, and in 2014 there were 17,856 warrants in the United Kingdom. It was, of course, the advent of satellite communications alongside the landline, which the post office had been monitoring, which led to increased surveillance. And then, of course, later on came the undersea fibre optic cables, which took over. These are monitored here by GCHQ in Cheltenham, Bude particularly for fibre optics, and in Cyprus for monitoring the whole of the Middle East. Alongside that, based here in Britain, we've got the NSA, we've got Menwith Hill in Yorkshire, which is like an internal US state, which is monitoring satellite telecommunications still. So we've got the old landline, the satellite in between, and we've got the fibre optics transferring masses of megabytes which are intercepted by GCHQ in the UK. But GCHQ, when I looked at it and followed all the Snowden business, doesn't just gather personal data, which is what the NSA does. It also actively intervenes and subverts targets. It has a program which it calls Online Covert Action, or what we would think of as dirty tricks. It's got a program, in fact, which can be used for good, maybe against very nasty people, but for bad if it's put in the wrong direction, known as the 4Ds. Now, the 4Ds are deny, disrupt, degrade, and deceive. Of course, they've got a more general power now, which is going to be legitimised. They've been using it for years. They're going to legitimise it under the new bill before Parliament, which is remote access. I first wrote about this, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. There were no legal powers, but this is the power which is going to be made legal for security services and for law enforcement agencies to interfere and enter and look at what you've got on your computer, to copy it, change it, add things to it. This will become legal. It's known remote access. It hasn't been legal. It will be legalised. It's how they always operate, that the security agencies see a chance of a new technological power, start to use it, and the law catches up years later to legitimate it. But if we want to understand really what happens with Snowden, we've got to look at what I call the surveillance trail. First of all, there's the gatherers of the intelligence, the data, the NSA, GCHQ. Then there are the users who use that data, that intelligence. That's the CIA, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, MI5, MI6, Special Defense Intelligence, law enforcement agencies. Thirdly, you've got the suppliers. These are the multinationals who supply the technology to enable that degree of surveillance. But these multinationals, of course, don't just help gather the information by the technology they supply, they also supply the technology of enforcement. For example, through smart borders, people coming in and out, so-called biometric passports. So that they come in, that they make more money two ways. Then what you've got, what I call, is the embedded nexus, which is where the users and the suppliers get together, where they meet in meeting after meeting, conference after conference, attended by directors general, industry, trade, whatever, in the EU Commission. They meet with the agencies, they meet with think tanks on that side, and they've got a little nexus there in terms of ensuring that their interests are properly protected. Of course, what you've then got are the targets. So, and against the targets, you've got the paraphernalia. It isn't just looking at what is on your computer or what is on your smartphone. It is data gathering anything about you, wherever it might have appeared. It is about undercover agents, it's about covert human information sources, and it's about remote access to your communications. The first target, of course, and I'm leaving aside the legitimate targets, what we would consider legitimate, are, of course, suspected terrorists. There's a measure which has been there for 3 years now in the European Union called radical messages. It's a 70-page questionnaire to be filled in either about individual or about groups as suspect groups. It was passed by what's known as soft law, that's a set of conclusions which enable the member states of the EU to act on the basis of it. And the remit of it is, I'm quoting here, extreme right stroke left, Islamist, nationalist, anti-globalization, etc. Talk about function creep. Then, of course, we have refugees and asylum seekers. And, of course, they are fleeing from war, persecution and poverty, but they're all potentially terrorists, criminals, economic migrants, out to exploit us. And, of course, after that, you get the migrant communities, who are targets for surveillance, infiltration, recruitment of informers. This fuels racism and contaminates the social and political life in these communities. Then we have domestic terror extremism. That's people who are planning, according to HMIC, political activity with an ideological, criminal activity with ideological ends. Then you've got the old enemies, old as capitalism, the rebellions, the riots, the underclasses and the precariat, who've got either skills and no hope or skills and little hope. Fifth, you've got enormous coordination over any cross-border operation towards protests in the EU. A massive paraphernalia, which has been in place for years. This, of course, leads to common tactics, in a sense, by the use of undercover people, dispensing justice on the streets, paramilitary policing. They even want to create a database on what they call troublemakers, but can't find a legal basis for doing it. These are people who have not committed any criminal offence, but who might commit a criminal offence with the label troublemakers. Of course, the final group is everybody who lives in the EU, because all of our telecommunications, that's our emails, faxes, phone calls, whatever you're using, records are kept or accessible to law enforcement, and now they just agreed this week, in their wisdom, to introduce EU PNR, which means that all travel not only in and out of the EU, but between inside the EU, from state to state, is going to be held and recorded. The next step, of course, is to record all the information, all travel within a country, which we've known for years is their final objective. So the last thing I want to talk about, it's a couple of pages, is to talk about the so-called refugee crisis. And just to look back quickly and see what's happened, which is quite a lot of our work and my work particularly is on. It was utterly predictable what happened last year. The Commission itself put out a press release on the 13th of January 2015. It said, in 2014, more than 276,000 migrants illegally entered the EU, which was an increase of 155% compared to the previous year. Even though it knew there was a problem, and a problem likely to grow, what did it do? And I mean do, in a sense, do its job in the good sense. It failed to act at all. It wasn't until September they finally noticed that 19 member states had not actually transposed, put into practice, the Asylum Procedures Directive and the Receptions Directive, which give protections to people arriving into refugees. 19 member states had not implemented it. And of course, implementing means putting international law, finding the money and the resources to put it into practice. That, even though they finally complied by Christmas, none of that was in place until around about now, because it takes a long time for that to come through. What is interesting, of course, when they looked at infringements, that every single EU member state, all 28 of them, had transposed and had into operation the Returns Directive. That, of course, is perhaps not surprising. Then we saw what has been very swift when I think back on it now. What was happening in Greece and Italy, the main reception countries, there was reception centres, which then were meant to be turned into hotspots. But they wouldn't turn them into hotspots until they could put several things in place, because the big demand was humanitarian assistance. Nobody was on the beaches when I was there last August. It was just volunteers. Just volunteers helping people, getting them in, giving them water, getting them into a centre where they might get some help and medical help. Because they were not prepared to give humanitarian aid, which they should have been obliged to do, until they could also put in place fingerprinting, nationality screening, security screening. None of that, they would not bring in humanitarian aid until the security state was there at the same time. Everyone had been recorded. All this was happening because it wasn't in place, that the hotspots weren't working properly. So in effect, over 1 million refugees relocated themselves last year throughout the EU. They were let through, quite rightly, by Greece and Italy. Move on, move on. And they relocated themselves. Of course, there's meant to be a scheme for relocation. That is, people in need of international protection. And the EU decided that there should be 160,000 places made available by the EU member states. Now, this tells you an awful lot about the EU. This was last September. And out of those 160,000 places that should be offered relocation of people in need of international protection, only 4,327 have been made available by member states, and in some cases they say they will only accept people of the Christian faith. It tells an awful lot about the racism in the EU. But then, of course, it all started to get catch up. Now they were in panics. Where were they to go? So first of all, we get what was a reception centre, a hotspot, now becomes a closed detention centre. It's a closed detention centre. The people there are going to be forcibly returned. The big problem, of course, is Turkey a safe third country to return people to? Right, if I've got 2 minutes now, I'll just make one simple point then. Sorry. The Commission has told everybody that it is safe. This is based on the idea that it's because it says it's safe, because the Commission says it's safe. However, Turkey has not signed up to the full Geneva Convention. And if it doesn't, it cannot be safe. And it says it will not sign up to the full Geneva Convention publicly. It is not a safe third country. It is a dodgy dossier presented by the EU, by the Commission, which is relying on what they call messaging. They're relying on a simple tactic. You put out the message all over the headline saying, all migrants will be returned. Failing to distinguish between migrants, refugees and rights. And they use the term messaging because they are gambling. They are gambling that before any cases can get to the courts, the problem will be over, because that could take years. And it is a cynical, deliberate tactic. So we're actually left with the position at the moment where the resolution is either going to be that the plan with Turkey, which is not a safe third country, does not work and lots more people will come over, in which case we'll see one question, or what is a more likely one is that the EU, and this is why all the big NGOs, the ones which aren't great, UNHCR whatsoever, have walked away from helping now from these closed detention centres, because it's against their principles and their constitution, but also because they know they could get done, and they would get done if they participated and helped in refoulement and returning people. So there's a double edge here. So the EU is gambling, and it's gambling, and the price of its gambling is that it will stop the refugee crisis, and it will have torn up every single international EU treaty defending human rights and rights of refugees in one fell swoop. Thank you.